Okay, I think we're good to get started. I think people who are going to show up are going to show up. So, yeah, brief introduction to what we're doing, what we're running for people who may have not been actively in the server or watching the chat. The CS Essentials project, what we're trying to do with this is help sort of make the transition from the general engineering first year freshman coursework into the sophomore year. I'm actually a computer science major now. Oh Lord, what do I do? Help make that transition a little easier. And so we're going to be going over some of the, I hesitate to call them basics because for some people it may seem basic. It may be like, okay, I've done this before. For other people, it may be really new and a little overwhelming. So essentials is a good way to put it. These are tools which some teachers or some classes might already expect you to be familiar with, but you may have not been exposed to before in your prior coursework. And especially as OSU is changing its curriculum and some of the expectations different professors will have will be different, we figured that this student-run initiative could be a good way to help get people up to speed. So yeah, with that, I think we can get straight into today's topic, which will be our inaugural session of Intro to SSH and how to use Flip, what Flip is, and what computing resources you have access to at OSU. So we'll go ahead and get started. If my PowerPoint wants to load. There we are. Yeah, so like I said, brief introduction as to what we're doing. The overall goal here is be able to have an opportunity to practice some of these skills in a low-stakes environment. Basically, if you have to learn Git and SSH and all these terminal utilities while you're also trying to learn the actual content of your course, that can be a little overwhelming. You have less time to experiment around and try new things, try different configurations, learn the right quote-unquote way to do something. You have less time to do that when you have an assignment that's due at midnight and there's all this pressure of, I have to get the actual graded component of this done. I don't have time to learn all these additional tools or whatever. So that's what we're here to do. Overall, the structure of these presentations is we're thinking we're going to do a brief, and I'm actually going to start my stopwatch to hopefully keep it brief. I have a tendency to ramble, so feel free to interrupt me with any questions or even just a, hey, I think the group gets it sort of deal. But we'll give a brief overview of what the topic is, why you care, why do you care about what SSH is or what computing resources you have access to kind of motivate the activity, and then do a brief walkthrough of here's how to actually use SSH and here's how to get access to those resources at OSU. And from there, the original plan was to split into breakout groups, but with the size of this group, I think it would be okay to just run it live. So anyone who wants the opportunity to actually practice doing SSH or practice logging into the Flip server, we've got quite a good handful of very experienced people here who'd love to help you. So we have an opportunity to have an activity at the end of this presentation as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into talk about what is Flip. You've probably heard me say Flip a few times. Just to address the question in the chat, yes, these sessions are being recorded. Actually, make sure. Yes, they are being recorded. Thank you for the reminder. So, if you're watching this from the future, as we said earlier, if there is any questions about the content or something that doesn't make sense, you can always ping us on Discord, and we will help you out. So, Flip is one of the servers at OSU. OSU, and specifically the College of Engineering, maintains a big old cluster of servers for use for computer science and engineering students to do their homework on, or do their research on, or run simulations, any of these things. These machines are all running Linux, and that's great because that means that you get access to a Linux box, a Linux environment that you don't have to install on your system, and you don't have to maintain on your system, which can be very helpful if you're already running Windows or Mac OS and you don't want to migrate your whole workflow over to another operating system just for the 4 years you're going to be in school here. And another thing to note about the servers is they are headless, which basically just means they're a server. They don't have a monitor connected to them. They don't have a graphical user interface. It is just a box somewhere else that's not your box that you get to run commands on. Some classes will absolutely require you to use these servers. I believe certain sections, or at least in the past, of data structures, CS 261, which you'll probably take your sophomore year, will just absolutely mandate, like, no, you have to take this on, or you have to run this code on the OSU server. It has to run on Flip. Somebody who's taken data structures more recently may want to correct me on that if that's no longer the case, but when I took it, that was at least the requirement. In CS 162 as well, yeah, which many of you, maybe if you're freshman, rising sophomore, going into in the fall term here, you might be required to run your CS162 homework on the Flip server. So when I say Flip, that is the general first point of access for any kind of SSH, or I want to log into another server at OSU. Flip is your first stop. Just as a quick side note, there is Flip 1, Flip 2, and Flip 3. That isn't really relevant for the purpose of SSHing in because they're load balanced. If you just type, and we'll show the command later, but if you just type flip.engr.oregonstate.edu, it will take you to one of the 3 Flip servers, and they're all functionally the same. I just want to put that out there because when you actually do the activity, when you log into SSH, you might see like, oh, my ONID, my OSU user ID would be Beery A, and it's like, oh, I see Beery A at Flip 1. I was like, well, I didn't log into Flip 1. It's going to automatically assign you to one of the 3. The great thing about Flip is, like I said, it's your first point of contact, so you don't require a VPN. You're not required to be on OSU's server, or excuse me, OSU's network in order to access Flip. Some of the other OSU servers, like Robert mentioned in chat, OS1 and OS2's server, which we actually talk about at the end here. We talk about how to use the other servers. Some of them require you to be connected physically to OSU's network some way. Either literally be on campus or through a VPN. There is a way around that, which we'll talk about, which also involves using Flip. That's all just to say that Flip doesn't require any of that. You can be anywhere in the world on any internet connection and log in through Flip, and it'll just take you there. There will be some authentication steps, which we'll walk through here in a moment, but overall process will be very similar. So, with that being said, I've talked about SSH a lot as well, and now that we've kind of motivated why you should care about SSH, I figured it's a good time to stop and actually ask, okay, what is SSH? SSH is a secure shell protocol. Effectively what that means is it's a secure way to run commands on another server, on another computer, from your computer. And so that means that when you log into OSU's servers, it's going to be a different file space, a different CPU, different environment that you're accessing through your computer. Your terminal basically just turns into a window into that server. That's important because say and I apologize if this sounds trivial to many of you who may already have access or experience with SSH, but I write some code on my system, I log in to Flip through SSH, I go in, my code's not there. Well, it's not going to be there because I'm just looking at somebody else's box and it's on somebody else's computer, right? So I'll have to upload that code somewhere. There's ways to do this with SFTP. You can either do it through the command line or there's clients like FileZilla and stuff like that. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. All of that's just to make it very clear, like this is somebody else's computer. That's also great because, and there's some configuration required behind it, but if I want to run a piece of code overnight, let's say I have a homework assignment or a project, it's going to take a long time to compute, I can throw that on OSU's server, shut down my computer, and it will continue running, assuming you've set up things properly to do that. That's not as simple as just SSHing in. You have to use tmux and stuff like that. But suffice to say, there's definitely advantages to running code on somebody else's box. There's also the issue of standardization with grading, like we mentioned earlier. Some classes will just outright require you to run the code on somebody else's box, because, take this for example, I write my C code that I'm writing for 162 or 261 or data structures and whatnot, and I run it, and it runs great on my machine, right? Runs great on my box. I send it to my grader, my TA. They can't even compile it in the first place. And they give me a 0. And I'm like, well, why did I get a 0? I did fine on that assignment. The reason that Flip exists, like one of the primary things you're going to be using it for, is to standardize all of that. So that you and the professor and the grader are all running your code on the same machine. There's no question of, well, it works on my machine. It will always just work. It'll be available. So, and everyone will be sharing the same resources. We're going to talk now about how SSH actually works and how to do it. Since we've talked about the who, what, and where, we're going to get into how to actually do it. The prerequisite to SSH is effectively have a computer. I'm being a little snide here. In the vast majority of cases, it's going to be pre-installed on your system. Note that I do say vast majority. If you're on Windows 7 or something, I make no promises that you're going to have easy access to SSH. With macOS, it's very likely, at least in any modern version of macOS, that it'll just be pre-installed, your terminal will be pre-installed, and the SSH client itself will be pre-installed. What that means is SSH is on your system. It's not something you're going to find if you just search in your applications menu. You know, I press the Windows key, I search SSH. It's not going to come up. But it's a command that you can run through your terminal. And if you're not familiar with terminal applications, and once again, I apologize because this will be very familiar to some of you and others you may not have any experience with, but the terminal is just another way of interacting with your computer in a way that doesn't require a graphical user interface, which is great because, as I mentioned, the servers don't have graphical user interface. So SSH is pre-installed in the sense of I can spin up my terminal, type SSH, and that command's there. You actually see on the right here where I did that on my system. I checked to see if it was installed. I'm on Windows 11. So I checked to see it's installed. It shows that it's there. I type SSH and the command runs. It doesn't just error out and say, well, there was no command found. On Linux, once again, I make no promises because I don't know what distro you're using. I don't know what configuration you've done. But in the vast majority of cases, Linux is going to have SSH pre-installed. You'd have to be on some really weird, you would have to be on some really weird stuff with Linux to not have SSH installed. If you're hearing, this is the second time I brought up Linux now. If you're hearing me talk about Linux and you're like, that sounds great and all, you say, OSU servers runs Linux, you're talking about Linux at the desktop environment as well. I'm not entirely sure what you're talking about, Aiden. OSU actually has a student group that's all about Linux and the Linux user experience on the desktop and how to use it for your dev tools and whatnot. They're one of the co-sponsors for the CS Essentials series that we're doing. Thank you. There's the plug. So for any of you that may not be familiar, we have a whole student group just dedicated to learning about Linux. They're a great group of guys, and everybody else. So if you want to learn more about that, that is a great place to start. Windows, it gets a little different. Like I said, older versions of Windows, I don't expect you to have access to this at all, and there are other tools to do it, but once again, beyond scope. Windows 10 and Windows 11, your terminal emulator, the best one to use at least will be Windows Terminal. You'll have to download that from the Microsoft Store. Now, we believe it might be pre-installed on newer versions of Windows 11, but if it's not on your system, if you can't just press the Windows key and search Windows Terminal and something comes up, if you go to the Microsoft Store, search Windows Terminal and install it, it will be there. And if that's not making sense or you can't find it, you can always ask, like I said, in the Discord for questions, and we can point you the right way. Windows Terminal is your terminal emulator. Okay, so that confirms it. Windows 11 is pre-installed. When I was on Windows 10, I had to grab it from the store, so I wanted to throw that in there just to be sure. So Windows Terminal is pre-installed. Maybe, maybe not. Either way, you can get it. SSH is almost definitely pre-installed. So once you have that terminal, once you launch PowerShell and whatnot, you should just be able to type SSH and something happens, and that something isn't an error. And that's what I'm demonstrating here on the right. So now that we've explained, how to actually get there, what the prerequisites are, how to make sure you have everything installed, the actual doing part of the exercise is fairly simple. It's mostly set up and making sure you understand, what a terminal is, what SSH actually does, what the actual process is. The code here, quote unquote, is not very difficult. You type SSH, and you type whatever your ONID is. So in this case, my OSU ID would be BRE-A, so I type BRE-A at flip.engr.oregonstate.edu, and that will take you right into the server. Kinda. You notice in this video here that I have posted, I type SSH, I log in, and it just takes me to a user environment. I'm on OSU server now. You can see it says BRE-A at flip2. I really should have made that get a little longer. Says BRE-A at flip2. I type ls. I see the files that are on the OSU server versus the files that are on my personal computer, and I'm just in. Your process probably won't be as painless as that, because in order to log into OSU server, you have to type in your password. It'll prompt you for whatever your user password is, and then it'll also prompt you for Duo. You have to press 1 and then enter, and then it sends a Duo notification to your phone, and it walks you through how to do all of that. But suffice to say, that's a huge pain in the ass if you're having to do this repeatedly. You're logging into your server or to OSU server 10 or 15 times a day to write your homework and whatnot and reconnect to it. That could get to be a huge pain to type in your password that many times a day. There's what's called SSH keys that let you do exactly what you're seeing here, which is just type the SSH command and then go straight to OSU server. No password required, no Duo required. And that is actually what we're going to be talking about next week, is how to use SSH keys to bypass that authentication step. At least I'm fairly confident that's going to be next week's presentation. Jonathan can correct me if I'm wrong there. So just wanted to add that in there. You'll need your password as well. But once we do that, then you should be able to get straight on the server. I wanted to just, on a brief aside, talk about what we talked about earlier with, there's Flip, which is, you can kind of access it from anywhere, and then there's other servers which you can't exactly access from anywhere, and we tell you how to get around that. Flip is meant to be public. It's exposed in the sense of it doesn't matter where you are or whose network you're on, you can just log into Flip. There's other servers that you'll have to... Oh, the slides will be posted later, but if somebody wants to type out that command real quick into chat, yeah, the SSH command, just for future reference. But if anything's not making sense, then all these commands, the slides will be public, so you can find them easily that way. As I was saying, though, there's other servers which you can't access as directly. You can't get to OS1, for example, or OS2 just by typing SSH owned at os1.engr. If you do that, it will error out. It'll just, it won't make the connection. And the reason for that is those servers are fully contained within OSU's network. You can't access them from outside the network. Naturally, that's a really big problem if you're not living on campus and you're like, hey, I'm at home, I'm trying to work on homework, but I'm not physically at OSU, and I can't connect to the server. And OS1 and OS2 very strictly require you, like, no, you have to run your code on the OS1 server, you have to run your code on the OS2 server. That's a really big problem. And so there's two solutions to this. One of which is the way it's always been done, which is to use a VPN, which basically just routes your connection. It takes you from your home network to OSU's larger network and then to the server. There's some caveats with VPNs, which we'll get into in the next slide. The other option is to do a proxy jump. Basically, and that just keeps you fully contained in SSH, which is great. I just SSH to Flip and then SSH to OS1 or whatever server I'm trying to touch. Because Flip is on OSU's network naturally, it allows me to connect to some of those other servers which are more protected. And so we get into that here in a moment, but talking about the VPN, which is the usual way of having to connect to these internal servers. For those familiar, VPN's virtual private network. I recognize there's a lot of acronyms being thrown around, so I'm trying to get the terminology out there. As I said earlier, it lets you be on OSU's network without being on OSU campus, effectively. This piece of software has had some problems. I have a link here for anyone who wants to learn how to set up the VPN and use it for their classes. And this is OSU's own walkthrough of how to set up their software. There's been some historical issues with using the VPN. First of all, it's just kind of a pain in the butt to use. It basically, every time you want to access the other server, you have to go, okay, I have to run this app, this other VPN app, type in vpn.org.edu, it prompts me for my username, password, owned. Then you have to then open SSH, grab your server, whatever you're trying to access, and SSH into that. That might also prompt you for username, password again if you don't have SSH key set up. All of that is to say, it can be a huge pain in the butt. Depending on what your home network looks like, the VPN could actually also slow down your personal internet connection. I'm putting a caveat on that again, because if you're on like 10 megabits down, it's not going to really matter, versus if you're on gigabit, then it'll probably really matter. It's like, wow, while I'm connected to the VPN, I'm on a much worse experience overall for my home network. There's been some privacy concerns as well. I want to just point out that the Cisco AnyConnect software has the ability to monitor your traffic. OSU is not monitoring your traffic. We have it on fairly good authority that they don't do that. They don't really care to do that. But it may be concerning to some users, just the fact that the software has the capability to do it in the first place. There's also been some reports of some latency issues on macOS and it tracking your user traffic even when you're not connected to OSU's VPN. Jonathan could go into more detail about that. I'm not entirely familiar with the situation. That is all just to say that we're introducing the VPN as you may have to use this at some point, but we're going to teach you how to avoid having to use it in most cases. And that's where proxy jump comes in. Proxy jump is great, and it is just a one-line command that lets you do exactly what I was talking about earlier, which is I go from my network, I SSH to Flip, and then I SSH to whatever other server I'm trying to hit. And it is quite literally as simple as just typing SSH, use the -J flag to specify what your middleman's going to be, type owned at flip.engr, and then type the server you're actually trying to hit. So in this case, if I want to hit OS1, I could do owned at os1.engr, there's other servers. I've talked about OS1 and OS2 a lot because those are the two that you're going to be, assuming you stay with OSU's computer science program, or that you are a computer science student, you're going to have to interact with OS1 or OS2 at some point in your probably junior year. So it's a good thing to know how to access those servers. Another one you may have to access is Rabbit or the HPC. Those are ones that we used in CS475 parallel programming, Professor Bailey, which was a really fun class, and I totally recommend it to anyone who's looking for an elective to pick up. But that's just to say that there's other servers you may need to hit. There's other stuff on OSU's cluster of servers that using this proxy jump will be super useful for going forward. But that is pretty much all we have for today. I just wanted to recap real quick. Flip is a great way to use Linux without having to actually install Linux. It's a great way to compile your C code into a Linux binary and be able to have a standardized environment so that you know that your professor, your TA, and you are all running the same machine, the same environment, same compiler, all those options. You don't have to worry about it. You just know that it works, hopefully.